Hi everyone, I realise this is the most ridiculous place to try and do this, so that's why I'm using the microphone. At the central junction in Jerusalem, nonetheless, that's where they put the plaque, so essentially you can look at the plaque, my eyebrows and whatever, and try and manage with the noise. A different location very much moves the story on, and I don't know how many times you've walked past here, but this area is so full of history on every street corner. Significant things have happened. This plaque here gives us that last little remainder of the landscape of memory of the British period, which commemorates when, in the presence of Herbert Samuel, the High Commissioner of Palestine, and Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the Commissioner, and the Mayor of Jerusalem, Rashid Nashabibi, who was a member of one of the major Chamulot or Jerusalem families, and had been involved in public works and the development of the city during the Ottoman period, and later on went on to become, well, somebody who tried to, stand up for Palestinian rights and hold the Arab cause. He was a member of the Arab High Committee later on, and then afterwards, after 48, minister in the for the Jordanians on refugees and holy sites. But I think the point to be said here is we walk along King George Street without even thinking, why the hell is there a street in the centre of Jerusalem named after, a monarch going back to the early 20th century, George V? And the answer is because that, as I think has probably become clear through Dave's presentation and my rather softer cultural introduction, is that the Zionist movement, the Jewish story, the Arab story, the conflict, the emergence of Arab nationalism, whatever is all happening under the umbrella of an imperial story, an imperial rule. So the fact that this avenue should be known as King George V Avenue is an act of the greatest chutzpah. And the fact that, the mayor of Jerusalem, Palestinian Arab, should be there to oversee it and to bless it in a way. Maybe it wasn't quite as problematic for Herbert Samuel, who was also Jewish and the Commissioner of Palestine, but that's a different story. But nonetheless, what the question posed is, as I think probably came out of the presentation from Dave, is what happens when imperial stories begin maybe in a benign way. I don't know how benign imperial stories ever can be, but then turn more complicated. So the truth of the matter is, this is a legacy of the 1920s when, largely speaking, the Zionist movement and the British government or the British mandate was relatively successful. But of course, the conflict and the hostilities happen in the more and more, or later into the late 20s and the 30s, exacerbated, brought on by, reflective of the gradual assertion of Arab Palestinian nationalism. In a way, if you want to put it in very blunt terms, why the hell would the Arabs of Jerusalem or of Palestine have to accept British rule? Why would the Jews of Palestine or Jerusalem have to accept British rule? And the fact that the Jews were seen as, I think rather mistakenly, they were technically at the time newcomers, but therefore not connected to this land, you can see we have the basis of a very horrible triangular conflict. Now, I mention it, by the way, because, of course, the next site that we're going to go to is a much grislier and much more dramatic example of British rule in Palestine. And it was active during the entire period. That's the prison. That's where you're heading to next, and maybe just say a couple of words about that. But I think to say this, history happened the way that it happened. Could the Jews and the Arabs have fallen in love with each other and worked out the rapprochement early on? Yes, they actually tried it. I mean, it was complicated and it was very elitist and all sorts. What the nature of the breakdown was, we will discuss. Me standing on a street corner is not the time to analyse all the intricacies of the Arab-Israel conflict. But suffice to say that in the 1920s, both Arabs and Jews had felt that something significant happened, which is that the Ottomans were no longer in control, and there was at least some possibility of something better under the control of the British. Of course, empires are empires, and so you can well, empires of that type are empires of that type, and so everything, of course, had to happen under their control. But the ability of each national movement to carve out and achieve their national goals was clearly pragmatic for both parties. In other words, the extent to which they could get development of the town, get control of the city, in this case the mayor of Jerusalem, or in the case of the Jews, of a relatively benign relationship with the British Mandate, is a pragmatic understanding. There may be ideology that other people may want to kind of kick in with, but largely speaking, these were national movements trying to do the very best for themselves. The inability to work things out for them, between them, and in a way almost unite against the British colonial rule, that's a moot point, and it's a discussion maybe for a little bit later on. So I want to pause it here simply by saying, draw your attention to this little piece of history, this landscape of memory that is all over the place, just from coming from the last site, which was the King David Hotel, to here, crossing lots of interesting places that you've seen before. They're all part of the same story, but the idea was to try and keep it short. I'm going to pick up in a little while, a little bit further down Jaffa.